At stage 3, you're going to start to see more violence, sometimes by both sides, but at least by one side. You see some pictures here of different things that go on as far as violence, either from the troops or against any kind of military force. Whenever the violence happens, though, in stage 3, one thing is clear. Both sides will blame each other. If the rebels are responsible for the violence, what they'll usually say is, look, we had to do it. We had to be violent because the government doesn't listen to anything else. The government says about the rebels, these guys are just a bunch of thug terrorists. They're violent because they want to be. They're simply using this as an excuse to bully and break things and hurt people and sometimes even kill people. So again, more finger-pointing here, and that does nothing to solve the problem. Instead, it just drives a wedge between the two groups and makes them go further apart. Now, at this point, we have not passed the point of no return. It is still possible to avoid a stage 4 rebellion here if both sides can kind of have cooler heads. But in most cases, it doesn't happen. What has to happen is both sides have to kind of say, whoa, wait a second here. If we keep going, this is going to result in full-scale war. We have to sit down and have peace talks before things go any further. The problem is that usually doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, that's impossible because by this point, the two sides have really started to hate each other, and the last thing they want to do is to give anything to the other side. And whenever you compromise, you have to be willing to back down a little bit. In a compromise, you have to give to get. At stage 3, most of the time, by the time a late stage 3 rebellion is taking place, neither the rebels nor the government ever want to give anything to the other side. But if they do, if you do have some people in there who can convince the rebels and the government both to come to the table, sit down, relax, you can avoid stage 4. But chances are at this point, it's not going to happen. Another thing that's going to happen at stage 3, which is really a big deal to the people, is you're going to see the economy start to drop. And we saw this in our game. We talked about why. It doesn't always happen in a rebellion, but it's extremely common. It usually happens. The reason why it happens is, as we know, spending is the number one thing to help the economy. When people are spending, businesses are making money. And when businesses are making money, they can hire more people, pay better wages, etc., etc. When no one is spending money, well, then businesses have to start laying off people. There's not enough jobs to go around, and that's when the economy starts to fail. When a rebellion is taking place and people start to get nervous about the future, they stop spending the money because they're scared. And that means businesses suffer. They're not taking in as much money. People are losing jobs. And what happens now is that makes a bad situation even worse. And that's when you get to stage 4. Stage 4 is the explosion phase. Basically, that's when both sides are done as far as talking and the real fighting begins. This is when the real revolution, the real war starts to take place. We see a pretty good picture here of what we mean. The conflict turns into open warfare. At stage 4, the government's going to send in the troops. The idea is the military is going to come in and subdue the rebel group, whether that's the Redcoats in the American Revolution or anybody else. Martial law starts to happen. It's enforced very tightly. That means anybody thought to be aiding the rebels is arrested. It doesn't matter if you've actually done something and there's evidence that you've committed a crime. Most of the time, people are simply arrested on suspicion. Same thing with searches. That happens as well. But if you're thought to be someone aiding a rebel, they can throw you in jail. And it happens in a lot of rebellions. The government basically cracks down and says, all right, we're going to suspend the rights of the people because this is an emergency situation. If we think you're guilty, you are. The rebels will respond. Usually what they will do now is work and look to use much more violent tactics. And again, it doesn't matter which war we're talking about here. The rebels are outnumbered. The rebels are almost always outgunned. So what they'll resort to now are guerrilla tactics and or terrorism because that's the only way that they can make any kind of headway against the enemy. Eventually, someone's going to win. Guerrilla tactics aren't very effective to win a war quickly. Usually what the rebels try to do is just hold on for a long time. The idea is if they make life miserable for the government's troops, the government will realize it's going to take an awful lot of time, effort, and money just to defeat the rebels. Maybe it's easier to give in to what they want. On the other hand, sometimes the military comes in and is so powerful, they crush the rebels right away and end the revolution. Eventually, though, someone has to win. Either the rebels will be victorious or the government is victorious. And when that happens, you finally move on to the last stage, which is stage 5, the resolution of the entire conflict. At stage 5, there's a victory. Someone has been victorious. And it doesn't really matter how long it goes. I mean, some of these rebellions last for days or a couple of weeks. Some of these drag on for years. The American Revolution is a good example of that. It lasted about 5 years since the beginnings, really around 1776, although the first battles were in 1775. It didn't end until 1781, so we're talking 5 or 6 years that the war dragged on. But eventually, like we said, someone's going to win. If the government wins and the rebels are defeated, usually this is what happens. Rebel leaders are executed. The idea is we're going to make sure you don't cause trouble anymore, and we're going to send a message to everybody else who may think like you think that if they try a rebellion, they're going to end up dead. In other cases, some are imprisoned. It really depends. The government doesn't want to execute everybody because that's an awful lot of people, and they don't want to be too harsh. So some people are just simply thrown in jail and kept there. If the rebels win, well, the same thing is probably going to happen. They're just going to do it to the government leaders. Whoever the president, the king was, members of the Congress, same type of thing is going to happen. They'll be hanged, they'll be guillotined, they'll be shot, or they'll be put in jail. Sometimes they'll be exiled, which simply means, hey, king, get out of here. You have to go somewhere else far away and never come back. We're taking over. And when they take over, the rebels will then form a new government, usually with them in charge. It's extremely rare that sometimes they bring someone else who wasn't part of a rebel group in, someone that they kind of had in mind who was away and came back, but always the rebels pick who is in charge of this new government, and usually it's them. And that'll be it. If the government wins, of course, the government will just simply keep the old government intact. Now, here's the catch. However, despite the fact that at Section 5 there is a revolution and somebody wins and somebody loses, it may not be over. The issue that caused the problem may not be resolved. And just killing some rebels or just changing the government may not change the fact that you've still got a problem with taxes that people think are unfair, or religion that is still tearing people apart, or the government, even the new government, the one that rebels have put in place. If the rebels win, maybe they just go and start abusing different people's rights. If the original problem hasn't been dealt with satisfactorily, meaning if the people in this country don't like the way the revolution has dealt with a problem, basically we go right back to stage 2. People still won't be happy. The problem still exists. Now, new rebels will emerge because many probably aren't around anymore. They're in jail or they're dead, or time goes on. It might be 20, 30, 50 years later, and new people come and take over. But new rebels will emerge. The whole thing may start over again when people say, you know, that problem we were fighting about, it still isn't solved. We need to take up that fight again. So a revolution, if it doesn't solve the original problem, will simply bring new problems. And that's why there are some countries in the world where there's been a constant state of revolution for a long period of time. The revolution hasn't solved anything. The idea here is to solve the problem. If whoever wins the rebellion doesn't solve the problem, you aren't really going to end the revolution. You might just temporarily have it die down for a while, but kind of like a fire that burns down to coals, you throw something on it, and it burns very, very heavily again. Revolutions are very similar. That is overall the way a revolution works. 5 stages to it, and they all work pretty much the same. Most of the time, no matter what country you look at, they'll all follow those same 5 steps.